Hello everyone, and welcome to the monthly lecture at the IWM, one which I'm particularly looking forward to as the issue of information, its dissemination and its impact in the Renaissance and Reformation period is a subject that I think is very interesting and actually teaches us quite a lot about today. And I think, Valentina, you're going to be considering some of the implications perhaps for today as well of your research. Valentina Lepri is a professor of history of philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, although she is, of course, Italian. She obtained her PhD in Civilization of Humanism and the Renaissance from the Istituto Nazionale di Studi sul Rinascimento in Florence, co-sponsored by the University of Pisa, I gather. And that was in 2007, after which she became a postdoctoral research fellow at the Herzog August Bibliothek in Germany and at the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies. In recent years, she's actually been awarded endless fellowships, but they have included Fernand Braudel's Senior Research Fellowship at the EUI in Florence and Maria Skłodowska Curie Fellowship and an ERC Consolidated Grant. So her monographs and articles explore the systems of knowledge, production and dissemination during the early modern age, especially focusing on academic teaching and on the forms of manipulation of 16th century philosophical and political texts. And she will be talking us today about her research. What can we learn from early modernity about self-learning experiences? Key questions, remarks, and research paths. Valentina, please take the stage.
Okay, good evening, and thank you so much for your kind introduction and for this opportunity. I'm truly honored to be in front of you and to get your feedback about my current work. Today I can give you just a few glimpses of a research that is being done on a sort of slippery slope, I would say. That's it, searching, sometimes finding and analyzing primary sources that are mostly fragmentary and sometimes hidden in European archives. My starting point is a trivial observation. Self-learning is an ambition that has always been with human beings. Certainly, it's not a phenomenon crystallized in the past. I don't need teachers, I don't need schools. I can provide my own education. I'm able, and this is a crucial point, to create my own method and develop my own understanding of reality. Some might say that self-learning practices are much more visible today than in the past, because the web has given everyone the illusion of educate oneself. We are basically surrounded by all kinds of tutorials and e-learning offerings, and after lockdowns during the COVID, I would say even more. In truth, self-learning practices had an intense flourishing in early modern age. And before explaining why, I'd like to start with a figure that we often associate with this epoch. Let me introduce you the topic with an illustrious example, Niccolò Machiavelli. Of Machiavelli, needless to say, everything has been studied, including his education. And scholars agree that at least a part of it was the result of self-learning practices. I mention him not only for this reason, but also because among his seminal works he left us, there is a pretty famous letter addressed to one of his friends, Francesco Vettori, in which we find a first-hand description of his self-learning practice. So I'd like to show you a fragment of this letter. We are in Sant'Andrea in Percussina, in the Tuscan countryside. it's December 1513, and Machiavelli is exiled there, accused of conspiracy against the House of Medici. This is not Sant'Andrea in Percussina. This is a drawing of Leonardo of Tuscan countryside. There, with no more daily political engagement, Machiavelli spent his time devoting himself hunting, farming, walking long distances in the wood, playing games in the tavern, and in the evening, on the coming of the evening, I return to my house and enter my study. And at the door, I take off my day's clothing, covered with mud and dust, and put on garments regal and courtly. And recluded appropriately, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them with affection, I feed on that food which is only mine and which I was born for, where I'm not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reason of their actions. And they, in their kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours of time, I don't feel boredom. I forget every trouble. I do not dread poverty. I'm not frightened by death. Entirely, I give myself over to them. Now, I'd like to bring your attention to the underlying parts in the fragment. Machiavelli talks with different thinkers and politicians of the past. There is a plurality of figures, meaning sources. He's not ashamed to speak with them. There is a freedom of dialogue. It's a sort of dialogue among peers. And during the process of learning, his body is also involved, combining focus and a sort of ataraxia, according to the ancient philosophical concept, the detachment from passions. Please note that multiple sources, lack of hope, and the body's involvement in the learning process are not peculiar of Machiavelli's experience. On the contrary, they are key elements that characterize all self-learning practices I'm currently considering. Before getting into the heart of the matter, however, it's necessary to answer the question why early modern age, and especially 16th and 17th century, should be a proper ground for investigating self-learning experiences. Why this particular period in human history? It's universally known that this epoch was marked by several changes, both positive and negative. Well-known geographical discoveries, well-known new technologies, such as the invention of movable types, are counted among the positive ones, while the negative ones include new brutal wars, even new ways to perform wars, and even religious wars with a clash between Protestant and Catholic wars, and to complete the picture's regular wave of plague. Changes did not spare the philosophical sphere, and reflections on knowledge processes either, and this is where my interest is focused. Most of the thinkers of the time devoted significant attention to the limits of human knowledge and to the value of the tools for acquiring and organizing knowledge, starting from those contained in Aristotle's doctrine. The medieval epoch had entrusted Aristotle with all responsibility for accessing knowledge, and the scholastic method derived from his doctrine was adopted in all European universities. From 15th century onward, this optimism had gradually broken down, and Aristotle's authority had been undermined. This because this method was perceived in this epoch to be insufficient to handle an increasing amount of information and data. Now, the reason behind this increasing amount of information and data are several. It's a very complex phenomenon. Put in very, very simple way, after the fall of Constantinople, and scholars and intellectuals running away to Europe brought with them an impressive number of unknown works, texts, that flooded the continent. It was a deluge that even became wider and more penetrating with the advent of printing. In this complex scenario, alternative methods to the scholastic method had begun to be experimented with. Various forms of skepticism also had ground, and most interesting for me, forms of collective self-learning practices even flourished. I'm dealing primarily with these collective practices because they are not only an intriguing case studies, but I would say a real challenge for a scholar. What am I talking about is a phenomenon of European magnitude, which manifested itself almost around almost every university at the time. It was led by groups consisting mainly of students, without guidance from a professor. These groups had a multi-phased nature, which can be described as a layered nature, and this also makes it difficult to analyze them. First and foremost, they adopted collective strategy. So it's necessary to put together information from several documents written by several authors, like if we were dealing with pieces of a puzzle. Then this group shared the same urban space of the university. So a potential dialogue or contrast between them must be evaluated. Last but not least, these groups were institutional milieu, since they were mostly formed by foreign students. That means that their provenance and their background must also be taken into account to see if any aspect, cultural aspect, could be influenced the intellectual sphere. Luckily, to explore this activity carried out by this group, one can count also with some documents. Official documents are the base of the research because these students were enrolled in the university, so we have their names, the faculty where they studied, the results in the studies, the name of the professor, so we have a guide, first guidance. The most important are private documents and printed volumes. Private documents are mostly letters and sometimes private notebooks. Printed volumes are volumes printed where the individual participating in the meetings were editors or supporters or promoters, I would say, maybe paying for the publication. Why are relevant? Because they show us the impact of their practices, the results, evaluating these printed volumes. Finally, censorship. It sounds awkward to see censorship here, because why the Inquisition could give me some information for my research? Well, ecclesiastic diplomats or representatives of the church or religious orders such as Jesuits in charge for monitoring the orthodoxy of these groups left to the scholars today reports and letters where we find useful information to reconstruct their activities. So they are in some way also useful. Now, reaching this point, I think it's time to bring to a concrete case studies to your attention, to also to summarize everything. This case concerns the so-called Contubernium Polonorum, literally the Polish dorms. We are in Padua, in the middle of 16th century, where a group of Polish students experimented with self-learning practices. Contubernium is a word derived from military vocabulary of ancient Rome and means a small unit of soldiers, 8 soldiers, sleeping together under the same tent. The term was first adopted to describe some humanistic Italian school schools. And these schools had in common, among other features, shared students' life and attention to bodily aspects of the education, such as physical education or the use of combining play and learning. Indeed, in the Contubernium Polonorum lived and worked together students of law, medicine, arts. And among them, we also find students who later, after studies, became important figures, such as Jan Zamoyski. During the meeting in the Contubernium, he was a student of law, later probably the most famous statesman, politician, chancellor in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Another figure that became famous later after the meetings is no Poles in this case, was the Hungarian Andreas Dudic. Why I'm mentioning Andreas Dudic? Because for me it was essential in finding information regarding their activity. They stay together, they meet together, have the same place. Where was the place in Padua? And among the information, they read together intensely. What they read? Several authors, and especially the works of Marcus Tullius Cicero. Next step. If we consider the volumes published as editors or promoters by the participants in this Contubernium, we see that there are many publications related to Cicero. That was not strange because it was really popular and intensely read, especially for the style of Latin. But what's interesting that these editors always published anthologies of fragments taken from Cicero's works, never whole works. It was always a result of selection of fragments. This leads one to speculate that I had this hypothesis that in addition to the practice of shared reading, students were also devoted to another practice known as exerpere. Leggere, annotare, and exerpere were key steps of a study practice already widely adopted in the Middle Age. Consisted of reading a text, leggere, noting its most salient passages, while the annotation could be on the sides of the page or in a so-called transitory medium, in the cognitive and physical sense, usually a notebook. Final step was exerpere, so meaning selecting notes already annotated, so already pre-selected, and gather them according certain topics or other criteria. What is the novelty behind it? That they made together. But there is more. Let's come back to consider what these united students in the Contubernium were annotating and selecting Cicero. I wonder if anything in particular from Cicero's works had also provided a general methodological guidance underpinning the self-learning practice they were conducting. I found some pieces of evidence, but the most convincing answer I could find far from Padua, in the Polish town of Zamość, where this very book, the Dialectica Ciceronis Maxime ex Stoicorum Sententia, was printed in the typography of the Academia Zamoyska, a university created by Jan Zamoyski himself in Zamość. Much like other books edited by the participants in the Contubernium, this volume is also an anthology created by extrapolating passages from Cicero's works. And all passages deal with the logic of Stoics. The exerpere gave the Stoics of logic. The editor of the volume was the professor of philosophy in the academy, Adam Bursky, and what he wrote in the introduction that deserves attention. He wrote that Jan Zamoyski gave to him the materials to be published in order to make free and available to the students in the academy both the method of Aristotle and that of Stoicism. I present you the final passage of this introduction, where Bursky quoted Zaimorsky's own words. I remember that when I was a student, I had noticed certain things of this kind, so that I would remember them, and I put them together in a diary. And if someone wanted to construct a building, then they have the bricks and mortar. Come on then, Bursky, here's the collection of these fragments. Read them, add to them, and publish them. At this point, I have to clarify one key aspect. In the 16th century, Stoic logic was not part of the curriculum of the University of Padua or other universities of the time. Basically, it was unknown, not taken into account. The interest on Stoic doctrine was confined to ethical sphere, not logical procedure. This means that only within the contubernium, Zaimorsky and his students fellow have done selection from Cicero's texts, putting together the logical doctrine of Stoics. The logical procedure of the Stoics, as well known, consider a relation between proposition instead of calculation of terms, at the heart of Aristotelian logic. In other words, the Stoics extended the analysis of syllogisms conducted by Aristotle by focusing on a new kind of syllogism. As I said, the tools of Stoic logic were unusual for the time, but it's impossible that they receive some attention in non-institutionalized groups experimenting with self-learning. Now, in my view, the reason behind this choice was consistent with the general trend of the time to which I referred at the beginning of my talk. It was an answer to the formalism of Aristotelian scholastic method, perceived as incapable of describing the richness of reality. In other words, this example shows us that behind the self-learning practices, there was an attempt at supplementing the teaching offered at university and attempting at finding additional methods. These groups opened themselves to explore further autoritates than Aristotle. And this reminds us of someone met earlier, Machiavelli. We have seen that Machiavelli spoke with politicians and thinkers of the past without being ashamed of them. So he considered several sources for his work. Similarly to what we observed for Machiavelli, the self-learning practices for such groups appears to be an experience that involved the body, that involved the life. Finally, Machiavelli was far from Florence, since exiled. The students performing self-learning were likewise all far from their own countries. My goal and ambition in the next step of my research, I confess here publicly, is to focus on precisely that, on the effect of their internationality on their practices. To conclude, what can we learn, if anything, about self-learning from early modernity? Certainly, self-learning experiences as openness to a multiplicity of viewpoints. We could say freedom, maybe. Will of sharing that multiplicity. We could say solidarity. And total experience of knowledge that is physical, life in common, intellectual, and cultural. Along with multiplicity, however, the needs and search for a method also became crucial to gain a sort of compass for sailing the ocean of reality and for ensuring the achievement of knowledge. And I finished.
Thank you, Valentina. So before I turn it over to the audience, I've got a couple of questions. You mentioned 1453, the fall of Constantinople, and the surge of material coming out of Constantinople with the refugees. When was this a point where you saw the emergence of this phenomenon of self-learning, or was it present before? What I'm trying to what I'm trying to get to is when do you identify that this becomes something that is spreading through Italy?
I did not identify, so it's not my work. There is a very famous volume in my field that is written by Anne Blair. It's focused on 16th, 17th century, and the title is Too Much to Know. Just, I love the title. It's just to explain that it was an epoch where it's not only a matter of amount of text. It was also a sort of propaganda of a generation of humanists, such as Erasmus, for instance, to have a place in the university. So proposing alternative methods, criticizing what was currently adopted at the university to carve some room for themselves. So for this reason, I said I'm simplifying very, very much, because it was also a narrative, a new narrative. This Vives, Erasmus, and other scholars to say, okay, we have this bone littere. With bone littere, we can develop an alternative method for knowledge, basically by using the artes sermocinales, and so rhetoric, dialectic, and many attempts. What is interesting for me that what was the same happening in the micro level of knowledge, as Peter Barker defined this phenomenon. So the small figures also had their attempts in the same direction.
And you mentioned also I was intrigued by censorship as one of the sources. So what are you able to identify what the censors are looking for and what sparks their interest, and whether there's, along with the self-learning in terms of the moving away from Aristotelian scholasticism, are there areas that they're moving into which the Jesuits and the Inquisition are suddenly saying, what's going on here?
No. They didn't take care regarding self-learning practices. They were extremely, especially the diplomats, the classical diplomats, they're extremely erudite, so they were able to read between lines, and extremely interesting the letters, because in the letters they are really genuine, saying, no, this is not dangerous, this is a good guy, he's doing well, it's interesting Plato, but it's okay. So it's really funny, and now is currently they are launching in Italy a great database with the letters of Commendone, who was a key figure because he was nuncius in Poland for many years. So, and his letters are really great sources, but all letters were kept in private archive of the family, and now in a few weeks will be available. And there I'm sure, because I had some bites, and I can find some information not regarding the Contubernium Polonorum, but another philosophical school carried out by Polish students again.
Yeah, and how did you come across, were you looking into Zamoyski specifically? How did you come across the network of Polish students in Padua who were...
Basically, every scholar in Poland at the time spent time abroad. It was a part of your education. It's not grand tour. You could define yourself as an adult if you spent not only in Italy, in France, the trajectories were various in Germany, and so all the teaching staff of the Accademia Zamoyska spent time in Padua, because Zamoyski studied there. He said Padua virum feci, something like this. And one didn't come abroad, and Zamoyski paid his stay, because it wasn't necessary to get a degree or PhD. Just a couple of years, you could stay 1 year in Paris, attending some lessons, 1 year another, and you could define yourself adult. So it wasn't strange. It was, and also after the studies, they still were in contact with their professors. So there are letters, for example, Bursky or other professors who wrote regarding illnesses and different stuff to professors in Padua. So.
And is all of the material that you're coming across in Latin, or is some in the vernacular as well?
No, in vernacular, yes, and even in Italian, because they were training Italian language. So it's funny that sometimes marginalia of Polish students are in Italian. Or the Nopols, the Dudic, during the meeting in the Contubernium, was trained with Polish. So he learned Polish there during that meeting. So extremely multilingual unit. Indeed, I have this problem. So I need, in the next steps, I need a team because I cannot manage all these languages, and especially to investigate the personal documents.
So we got French, German, Czech.
Everything.
Everything.
Ancient Greek, Hebrew. So they studied a lot.
So I was fascinated about your observations about Machiavelli and when you said that he wrote that he went to the ancient courts.
No, it's really, but it couldn't feel anything for 4 hours. It's a kind of trance, no?
That's the point. It's so I've got deep focus, deep learning here, and it's very interesting. This too much information, for example, and it's very similar to the experiences that we have now, where we have overload of information, and one way of escaping it is by just burying yourself in a single book and examining a book very closely. It was precisely that the same experience that Machiavelli had.
Yes, but he was a genius, so he created a method. He created something completely new. It is also the reason, because there are studies on self-learning practice, what singular person, but usually Newton, Machiavelli, so genius, they're not so representative of the general self-learning practice. You can see, oh, what wonderful, because the letter that I quoted at the beginning is famous. Why? Because in this letter, for the first time, Machiavelli say, I finished to write the Principatibus, because I'm here, I don't know how to spend my time. I write this a small essay. So everybody remember this letter. So during these self-learning activities, he wrote The Prince. But in The Prince, he didn't select a method, he made the method. He made a standard.
I note in passing that you said that the internet gives us the illusion of self-learning. Why is the internet an illusion of self-learning, and your characters from the 16th century real self-learners?
Because you grant everyone to be an authoritas. It's everybody can potentially be your Aristotle. So you have in front of you hard work to select. You are overwhelmed. Of course, it depends on what kind of learning, it's your goal, it's your aim. But the offer is really big.
Okay, and I've got one final question, a big picture question about the 16th century. With this proliferation of the self-learning and the information and so on, can you see any relationship between this and the spread of Protestantism and the backlash, the early stages of the Counter-Reformation?
You mean the self-learning practices?
Yes,
okay.
The self-learning practices. Because people are being able, they are no longer dependent solely on the church or the universities for exchange of information.
I would say differently, that Reformation as Calvinism, as a Catholic Church, adopted their own method. Calvinism, Ramist method, the loci communes, the Protestant area, and the strange Aristotle Catholic ones. I think the very independency was made by a hidden revolution, the revolution of paper, the printing. Make a great revolution in the production of paper, because the paper factories, stimulated by the needs of printers, made paper available, giving the space for independency and for freedom. Until the 14th century, 15th century, to be precise, there was the system of pecha. Do you know the system of pecha? Was a folder made by parchment. Under detection, the professor gave the lection to the copyist, professional copyists, and then they were sold to everybody. With the paper, students became free to write what they want, to practice self-learnings. So it was a kind of the emancipation from the method selected by certain universities under certain religions.
Great, thanks a lot, Valentina. Let me throw it open to our colleagues. I see Jan, his hand is up there straight away.
Well, Jan Farfal, Jerzy Giedroyć Fellow, thank you for this fascinating talk, and it's really nice to see some Polish aspects about the Polish Renaissance and Jan Zamoyski. Two questions, one related to, let's say, the methodology within the domain of intellectual history, and one more general. So I'm just wondering, how do you relate in your studies to Quentin Skinner's school of contextual approach versus this dialogue with the past generations? Because in one of the instances you mentioned Machiavelli discussing it with ancient authors, and this from the practice of contextualists would be a blasphemy. So I'm wondering, how do you narrow that issue? And the second more general question is about this practice of self-learning, which originated, as you tell us, at the beginning of Renaissance. What are the links between this kind of movement to encyclopedists who operated in 18th century? Do encyclopedists relate to these practices, and your characters were the source of inspiration for them, or it went a different way?
My answer is similar for both. I mean, I have still to analyze thousands and thousands of documents before make any connection with the huge interpretation like the one of Skinner's and any other. So now I'm really close to the documents. So the case studies they presented today, it's still at the very beginning. So and also in the case, the second question was related to the
encyclopedists.
Yes.
Of the 18th century.
I think so, because there is the same aim of organizing the informations, but it would be really too risky for me to say at this stage of my no.
It is. Of course it's too risky.
It's too risky to say that at this stage of my research I say, no, I see really an avenue going there. No, and I'm also recorded, so maybe someone, I receive emails from colleagues, what you said. So, yes, also about Skinner.
Any other questions? I think Galina was first.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot for just a fascinating presentation. I totally agree with Jan. Yeah, and my questions, actually, I also have two questions. One will continue Misha's one, and one from which I will start. I was thinking about this notion that you said, physical experience of knowledge. Could you please comment a little bit more? It's something interests me, because what I understood from the quotation from Machiavelli, it could be also considered on the one side as a metaphor, on the other side it is like this early modernity understanding of body and this turn into, is it like correlate to the knowledge production, or it's something different, or I don't know, any other metaphors of like physical, I don't know, capability, ability of learning, or something like how it was stressed. And another one, I was thinking about the, could you please comment, and I don't know much about it, but on the status of universities towards the religious institutions. It seems to me that you are talking about, especially in the context of Poland, yeah, you're talking about like a case of secularization of knowledge. But at the same time, you pointed out to the religious wars and the extrapolation of like religion and so on, and how this, on the one side, religious, on the other side, like secular knowledge relate with.
I already forgot the first question. I try. Okay. Physical experience of knowledge. This is a big topic, really. You put your hand on something really burning, because there is a huge literature in the period regarding the involvement of the body for the best learning. So it wasn't a metaphor at all. It wasn't really something that was training for. So live together and also touch, and also have the document was a physical object. It was something relevant, and there are treatises on the study methods, really common at the time, and in each of them you can find the references to the fact that you have to live your learning process, you have to experience with your body and to everyday life. So, because your curiosity otherwise cannot be stimulated. So this the difference between us and artificial intelligence, because we live knowledge deeply. I'm not sure if I got the second question regarding the relationship between institutions and religions and universities. Okay, yeah, now it's clear, sorry. The university followed the politics adopted by the closest, the government, and sometimes the church in the governments. I give you the example of Padua. Padua had the protection of the Republic of Venice, the Serenissima. So he claimed libertas philosophandi because they were protected. But they were monitored. Indeed, I have sources thanks to the monitoring.
And who was monitoring them?
Who?
Yeah.
Jesuits quite often sent there for studies, but they sent back reports regarding the activities there. But in certain way, that worked the protection of the states against the Catholic Church. For 20 years, Galileo was there, teaching mathematics. Copernic was there as a student. When Galileo left, Padua was in trouble and faces. Or an example. Many professors came through trials in front of the Inquisition, Pietro Pomponazzi and Cesare Cremonini every year. And every year he used as a justification of his teaching of philosophy the fact that theology and philosophy are two different disciplines. I'm talking as a philosopher, not as a theologian. This is exactly the same argument spent by Giordano Bruno. But Giordano Bruno wasn't in the university, so couldn't have the advantage of the institutions. So the groups I am exploring are out of the systems of protection and control. And you can imagine the university at the time like a galaxy. The center is the university, and around are many more or less institutionalized entities like academies or professors teaching out of the university, the famous Scola Domestica by Melanchthon, for instance, but basically following the political, social, and religious arrangement. These students could have much more freedom, and this was the reason to be monitored.
I have a question from a completely different perspective, or maybe a comment. So far away from history, trying to, stimulated by what you presented, think about what self-learning and what your findings could mean for today. If I understood it right, you would define self-learning as everything that is not too much determined by the methodology prescribed by the university or by one teacher or a group of teachers. And I think we all would agree that this is important, to have independent thinking, learning, and so on. But there is a lot that we could subsumize under this definition. So it would be what you presented, namely groups of students that, in fact, they don't learn isolated, but they learn with each other, by discussing, and so on. And as you mentioned the example of Machiavelli, he did it on his own in his situation. But this is a big difference, I think. And I would say if there is a risk that we would also subsumize reading everything we find in the internet as self-learning, that's exactly what is the problem, is if we don't also discuss this with others, with people, also with people, not only with our peers, but also people who would think maybe differently, because that's where it's really risky.
Yes,
I was wondering if this is something you also think about in your research, because you presented examples of one learning isolated, I mean in dialogue with ancient people, of course.
Yeah.
But this you could also compare to someone searching the internet. There is also a lot of sources, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In contrast to a group of people, of students, who really dedicate most of their time in learning, but together.
Yeah.
And this is also a very important corrective, of course.
Yeah, but if you go through many websites, no, and you make some e-learning by yourself, basically you try to study. What is the difference with learning, self-learning? That you try to have also a ratio studiorum, a method and a program and the final goal. This is the main difference. So then the student not only met together, they decided to do something with the method. For me, was really a moment of great happiness to find they had the interest on Stoic logics, because it was an attempt to have not only surfing on sources, but also to make a school out of the school, with a curriculum, with a path.
Kadri?
Thank you, Kadri Leek, Europe Futures Fellow. Thank you very much for the lecture. I would want to ask you to elaborate maybe a little bit more about censorship and freedom, the sort of proportion of censorship or freedom that are conducive for self-learning. I mean, why I ask? To me, I immediately remembered my time at university. I did my first degree at Tartu University. I started in 1988. It was when Soviet Estonia. I studied journalism, and in our curriculum we had history of a communist party, we had history of Russian journalism, but under these labels we studied actually something totally else. I remember our tutor came to the room, said, yeah, you know, dear children, are supposed to study history of Russian journalism. It's mostly history of censorship. Do you mind if we did actually something else? And he gave us an overview of Western philosophy, not very systematically, but actually, you know, many of the big names I heard that for the first time. Likewise, Communist Party, I mean, we actually studied proper history under that. But, you know, what made it necessary and possible, it was rigid curriculum that was sort of stuffed with every Soviet era subject, but at the same time sufficient freedom that you could just ignore it. You know, nothing happened. You could do that. So I wonder if, how does it look from sort of your totally different perspective?
Oh, it's a huge question. I have no idea, basically. I mean, for sure, the logic of Stoics was not present in university, so was a kind of under effect of the censorship. But I could not compare your experience in Tartu with this group them exploring. Also because placed in different environments, different intellectual milieux. So I cannot say, okay, for this case they have room for freedom and the other. So it would be really an answer of 2 hours. We have 2 hours?
No.
No. So maybe we can discuss later. And you can tell me more regarding this experience. No, because it's inspiring.
Is that Miha at the back? Yeah. Sorry.
Alminakov, visiting fellow. Thank you very much for a very interesting report, and like you're pushing us to think about early modernity, although I work on late modernity. And here I was listening to your report and compared with the history of universities, and we witness in 16th, especially in 17th century, an explosion of this type of this model around Europe, and then to far to east in Russia and far to Northern America. Mm-hmm. So, and in this explosion, you definitely see the deficit of certain intellectual practices, of good lectures, of accessible professors, and hence we have self-learning groups. And still you named you named several big names from 17th century, and you already see how this network of intellectuals who avoid universities or create alternative spaces in the form of society of scholars or academies in Paris, because universities are too restrictive. So is this what I heard from you and my interpretation? Yeah. Is it connected to this restrictive nature of university?
Yeah, some of you are pushing me to give a big picture. But I'm convinced by your overview, really. So it's possible, but again, I'm still on the desk exploring documents. Then maybe in a few years we can discuss. Yes, it's a matter of fact that there is a proliferation of this kind of activities, but step by step, I would say.
Did you want to?
Yeah, short question.
Well, thank you for sharing your research with us. I wonder if you could say more about any resemblance between the groups you are studying and monastic studying and monastic learning. Perhaps it's completely different. I know too little about it. I'm not talking about universities, but monks in groups studying together. Maybe you have something to say about that.
I'm not an expert. For sure it's an interesting avenue of research. Would be convenient a comparison with the groups of Jesuits that study next door to my groups. But again, they were really already organized from the high level, so there were persons. But I'm not an expert, so I would just make some assumptions, not useful. But thank you, it's a really good idea.
I've got a middle picture question, not a big picture, a small question. It's just I'm fascinated by your concentration on Zamoyski, and whether you've observed that whether any of this relates to the fact that the Renaissance had such an impact in Poland relative to other countries. Is there anything you've seen in your work on Zamoyski and his friends that indicates why the Renaissance had such an impact in Poland?
Okay, this is a really difficult one. I strongly believe, and here I give you a picture, yeah, that they didn't adopt Renaissance in Poland. They had their own Renaissance that must be studied, not in terms of influence, echoes of phenomenon that happens in Italy, in France. They have some really crucial aspect and originality. So it's just that we have already a crystallized image of the concept of Renaissance. So if we have time to go in the archives and see what is written in the documents, then we can think about a more comprehensive picture of the epoch, of the Renaissance.
But obviously Padua would have had a formative...
Everybody remember when he was 20 abroad with friends, so of course, and it was a really brilliant place. But Zamoyski spent times also in Paris, so not only there.
Thanks. Any more questions?
I would like to thank you, really, from the bottom of my heart, because the discussion was extremely precious for me to orient my next steps.
You're more than welcome, Valentina. And as a prize, we can invite everyone downstairs for some wine and cheese for being such a good audience. Thank you very much, Valentina. That was fascinating. Well done.